But on the 13th of June, the very day before Negoro reckoned on obtaining from Mrs. Weldon the letter which should be the means of securing him $100,000, tidings were circulated in the district that on the 1st of May, Dr. Livingstone had breathed his last. The report proved perfectly true. On the 29th of April, the caravan had reached the village of Chitambo, the doctor so unwell that he was carried on a litter. The following night he was in great pain, and after repeatedly murmuring in a low voice, "Oh dear, he fell into a kind of stupor. A short time afterwards he called up Susie, and having asked for some medicine, told his attendant that he should not require anything more. "You can go now." About 4 o'clock next morning, when an anxious visit was made to his room, the doctor was found kneeling by the bedside, his head in his hands in the attitude of prayer. Susie touched him, but his forehead was icy with the coldness of death. He had died in the night. His body was carried by those who loved him, and in spite of many obstacles was brought to Zanzibar, whence, 9 months after his death, it was conveyed to England. On the 12th of April, 1874, it was interred in Westminster Abbey, counted worthy to be deposited amongst those whom the country most delights to honor. Chapter 15. An exciting chase. To say the truth, it was the very vaguest of hopes to which Mrs. Weldon had been clinging, yet it was not without some thrill of disappointment that she heard from the lips of old Alves himself that Dr. Livingstone had died at a little village on Lake Bangweolo. There had appeared to be a sort of a link binding her to the civilized world, but it was now abruptly snapped, and nothing remained for her but to make what terms she could with the base and heartless Negoro. On the 14th, the day appointed for the interview, he made his appearance at the hut, firmly resolved to make no abatement in the terms that he had proposed, Mrs. Weldon, on her part, being equally determined not to yield to the demand. "There is only one condition," she avowed, "upon which I will acquiesce. My husband shall not be required to come up the country here." Negoro hesitated. At length he said that he would agree to her husband being taken by ship to Mossames, a small port in the south of Angola, much frequented by slavers, whither also, at a date hereafter to be fixed, Alves should send herself with Jack and Benedict. The stipulation was confirmed that the ransom should be $100,000, and it was further made part of the contract that Negoro should be allowed to depart as an honest man. Mrs. Weldon felt she had gained an important point in thus sparing her husband the necessity of a journey to Kazand, and had no apprehensions about herself on her way to Mossames, knowing that it was to the interest of Alves and Negoro alike to attend carefully to her wants. Upon the terms of the covenant being thus arranged, Mrs. Weldon wrote such a letter to her husband as she knew would bring him with all speed to Mossames, but she left it entirely to Negoro to represent himself in whatever light he chose. Once in possession of the document, Negoro lost no time in starting on his errand. The very next morning, taking with him about 20 Negroes, he set off towards the north, alleging to Alves as his motive for taking that direction, that he was not only going to embark somewhere at the mouth of the Congo, but that he was anxious to keep as far as possible from the prison houses of the Portuguese, with which already he had been involuntarily only too familiar. After his departure, Mrs. Weldon resolved to make the best of her period of imprisonment, aware that it could hardly be less than 4 months before he would return. She had no desire to go beyond the precincts assigned her, even had the privilege been allowed her, but warned by Negoro that Hercules was still free, and might at any time attempt a rescue, Alves had no thought of permitting her any unnecessary liberty. Her life therefore soon resumed its previous monotony. The daily routine went on within the enclosure pretty much as in other parts of the town, the women all being employed in various labors for the benefit of their husbands and masters. The rice was pounded with wooden pestles, the maize was peeled and winnowed, previously to extracting the granulous substance for the drink which they call mtl. The sorghum had to be gathered in, the season of its ripening being marked by festive observances. There was a fragrant oil to be expressed from a kind of olive named the mpafu. The cotton had to be spun on spindles, which were hardly less than 1.5 feet in length. There was the bark of trees to be woven into textures for wearing, the manioc had to be dug up and the cassava procured from its roots. And besides all this, there was the preparation of the soil for its future plantings, the usual productions of the country being the maritime beans, growing in pods 15 inches long upon stems 20 feet high, The arachides, from which they procure a serviceable oil, the chilobe pea, the blossoms of which are used to give a flavor to the insipid sorghum, cucumbers, of which the seeds are roasted as chestnuts, as well as the common crops of coffee, sugar, onions, guavas, and sesame. To the women's lot, too, falls the manipulation of all the fermented drinks, the malafu, made from bananas, the pombe, and various other liquors. Nor should the care of all the domestic animals be forgotten. The cows that will not allow themselves to be milked unless they can see their calf or a stuffed representative of it, the short-horned heifers that not unfrequently have a hump, the goats that, like slaves, form part of the currency of the country, the pigs, the sheep, and the poultry. The men, meanwhile, smoke their hemp or tobacco, hunt buffaloes or elephants, or are hired by the dealers to join in the slave raids. The harvest of slaves, in fact, being a thing of as regular and periodic recurrence as the ingathering of the maize. In her daily strolls, Mrs. Weldon would occasionally pause to watch the women, but they only responded to her notice by a long stare or by a hideous grimace. A kind of natural instinct made them hate a white skin, and they had no spark of commiseration for the stranger who had been brought among them. Halima, however, was a marked exception. She grew more and more devoted to her mistress, and by degrees, the two became able to exchange many sentences in the native dialect. Jack generally accompanied his mother. Naturally enough, he longed to get outside the enclosure, but still, he found considerable amusement in watching the birds that built in a huge baobab that grew within. There were marabous making their nests with twigs. There were scarlet-throated suimangas with nests like weaver birds, widow birds that helped themselves liberally to the thatch of the illustration. The insufferable heat had driven all the residents within the depot indoors. Huts, calows with their tuneful song, gray parrots with bright red tails, called roofs by the Manuma, who apply the same name to their reigning chiefs, and insect-eating drongos like gray linnets with large red beaks. Hundreds of butterflies flitted about, especially in the neighborhood of the brooks, but these were more to the taste of Cousin Benedict than of little Jack. Over and over again, the child expressed his regret that he could not see over the walls, and more than ever he seemed to miss his friend Dick, who had taught him to climb a mast, and who he was sure would have fine fun with him in the branches of the trees, which were growing sometimes to the height of 100 feet. So long as the supply of insects did not fail, Benedict would have been contented to stay on, without a murmur in his present quarters. True, without his glasses, he worked at a disadvantage, but he had had the good fortune to discover a minute bee that forms its cells in the holes of worm-eaten wood, and a sphex that practices the craft of the cuckoo, and deposits its eggs in an abode not prepared by itself. Mosquitoes abounded in swarms, and the worthy naturalist was so covered by their stings as to be hardly recognizable. But when Mrs. Weldon remonstrated with him for exposing himself so unnecessarily, he merely scratched the irritated places on his skin and said, "It is their instinct, you know, it is their instinct." On the 17th of June, an adventure happened to him which was attended with unexpected consequences. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning. The insufferable heat had driven all the residents within the depot indoors, and not a native was to be seen in the streets of Kazand. Mrs. Weldon was dozing, Jack was fast asleep. Benedict himself, sorely against his will, for he heard the hum of many an insect in the sunshine, had been driven to the seclusion of his cabin, and was falling into an involuntary siesta. Suddenly a buzz was heard, an insect's wing vibrating some 15,000 beats a second. "A hexapod," cried Benedict, sitting up. Short-sighted though he was, his hearing was acute, and his perception made him thoroughly convinced that he was in proximity to some giant specimen of its kind. Without moving from his seat, he did his utmost to ascertain what it was. He was determined not to flinch from the sharpest of stings, if only he could get the chance of capturing it. Presently he made out a large black speck flitting about in the few rays of daylight that were allowed to penetrate the hut. With bated breath he waited in eager expectation. The insect, after long hovering above him, finally settled on his head. A smile of satisfaction played about his lips as he felt it crawling lightly through his hair. Equally fearful of missing or injuring it, he restrained his first impulse to grasp it in his hand. "I will wait a minute," he thought. "Perhaps it may creep down my nose, by squinting a little perhaps I shall be able to see it." For some moments hope alternated with fear. There sat Benedict with what he persuaded himself was some new African hexapod perched upon his head, and agitated by doubts as to the direction in which it would move. Instead of traveling in the way he reckoned along his nose, might it not crawl behind his ears or down his neck, or, worse than all, resume its flight in the air? Fortune seemed inclined to favor him. After threading the entanglement of the naturalist's hair, the insect was felt to be descending his forehead. With a fortitude not unworthy of the Spartan who suffered his breast to be gnawed by a fox, nor of the Roman hero who plunged his hand into the red-hot coals, Benedict endured the tickling of the 6 small feet, and made not a motion that might frighten the creature into taking wing. After making repeated circuits of his forehead, it passed just between his eyebrows. There was a moment of deep suspense lest it should once more go upwards. But it soon began to move again. Neither to the right nor to the left did it turn, but kept straight on over the furrows made by the constant rubbing of the spectacles, right along the arch of the cartilage till it. Illustration. Before long the old black speck was again flitting just above his head. Page 432. Reached the extreme tip of the nose. Like a couple of movable lenses, Benedict's 2 eyes steadily turned themselves inwards till they were directed to the proper point. Good, he whispered to himself. He was exulting at the discovery that what he had been waiting for so patiently was a rare specimen of the tribe of the Cicindelidae, peculiar to the districts of southern Africa. A tuberous manticora, he exclaimed. The insect began to move again, and as it crawled down to the entrance of the nostrils, the tickling sensation became too much for endurance, and Benedict sneezed. He made a sudden clutch, but of course he only caught his own nose. His vexation was very great, but he did not lose his composure. He knew that the manticora rarely flies very high, and that more frequently than not it simply crawls. Accordingly, he groped about a long time on his hands and knees, and at last he found it basking in a ray of sunshine within a foot of him. His resolution was soon taken. He would not run the risk of crushing it by trying to catch it, but would make his observations on it as it crawled. And so, with his nose close to the ground, like a dog upon the scent, he followed it on all fours, admiring it and examining it as it moved. Regardless of the heat, he not only left the doorway of his hut, but continued creeping along till he reached the enclosing palisade. At the foot of the fence, the manticora, according to the habits of its kind, began to seek a subterranean retreat, and coming to the opening of a mole track entered it at once. Benedict quite thought he had now lost sight of his prize altogether, but his surprise was very great when he found that the aperture was at least 2 feet wide, and that it led into a gallery which would admit his whole body. His momentary feeling of astonishment, however, gave way to his eagerness to follow up the hexapod, and he continued burrowing like a ferret. Without knowing it, he actually passed under the palisading, and was now beyond it. The mole track, in fact, was a communication that had been made between the interior and exterior of the enclosure. Benedict had obtained his freedom, but so far from caring in the least for his liberty, he continued totally absorbed in the pursuit upon which he had started. He watched with unflagging vigilance, and it was only when the hexapod expanded its wings, as if for flight, that he prepared to imprison it in the hollow of his hand. All at once, however, he was taken by surprise. A whiz and a whir, and the prize was gone. Disappointed rather than despairing, Benedict raised himself up and looked about him. Before long the old black speck was again flitting just above his head. There was every reason to hope that it would ultimately settle once more upon the ground. But on this side of the palisade, there was a large forest a little way to the north, and if the manticora were to get into its mass of foliage, all hope of keeping it in view would be lost, and there would be an end of the proud expectation of storing it in the tin box, to be preserved among the rest of the entomological wonders. After a while the insect descended to the earth. It did not rest at all, nor crawl as it had done previously, but made its advance by a series of rapid hops. This made the chase for the nearsighted naturalist a matter of great difficulty. He put his face as close to the ground as possible, and kept starting off and stopping and starting off again with his arms extended like a swimming frog, continually making frantic clutches to find as continually that his grasp had been eluded. After running till he was out of breath, and scratching his hands against the brushwood and the foliage till they bled, he had the mortification of feeling the insect dash past his ear with what might be a defiant buzz, and finding that it was out of sight forever. "Ungrateful hexapod," he cried in dismay, "I intended to honor you with the best place in my collection." He knew not what to do, and could not reconcile himself to the loss. He reproached himself for not having secured the manticora at the first. He gazed at the forest till he. Illustration. For that day, at least Cousin Benedict had lost his chance of being the happiest of entomologists. Page 435. Persuaded himself he could see the coveted insect in the distance, and seized with a frantic impulse, exclaimed, "I will have you yet." He did not even yet realize the fact that he had gained his liberty, but heedless of everything except his own burning disappointment, and at the risk of being attacked by natives or beset by wild beasts, he was just on the very point of dashing into the heart of the wood when suddenly a giant form confronted him. As suddenly, a giant hand seized him by the nape of his neck, and lifting him up, carried him off with apparently as little exertion as he could himself have carried off his hexapod. For that day, at least Cousin Benedict had lost his chance of being the happiest of entomologists. Chapter 16. A Magician. On finding that Cousin Benedict did not return to his quarters at the proper hour, Mrs. Weldon began to feel uneasy. She could not imagine what had become of him. His tin box with its contents were safe in his hut, and even if a chance of escape had been offered him, she knew that nothing would have induced him voluntarily to abandon his treasures. She enlisted the services of Halima, and spent the remainder of the day in searching for him, until at last she felt herself driven to the conviction that he must have been confined by the orders of Alves himself. For what reason she could not divine, as Benedict had undoubtedly been included in the number of prisoners to be delivered to Mr. Weldon for the stipulated ransom. But the rage of the traitor when he heard of the escape of the captive was an ample proof that he had had no hand in his disappearance. A rigorous search was instituted in every direction, which resulted in the discovery of the mole track. Here beyond a question was the passage through which the flycatcher had found his way. "Idiot, fool, rascal," muttered Alves, full of rage at the prospect of losing a portion of the redemption money. "If ever I get hold of him, he shall pay dearly for this freak." The opening was at once blocked up. The woods were scoured all round for a considerable distance, but no trace of Benedict was to be found. Mrs. Weldon was bitterly grieved and much overcome, but she had no alternative except to resign herself as best she could to the loss of her unfortunate relation. There was a tinge of bitterness in her anxiety, for she could not help being irritated at the recklessness with which he had withdrawn himself from the reach of her protection. Meanwhile, the weather for the time of year underwent a very unusual change. Although the rainy season is ordinarily reckoned to terminate about the end of April, the sky had suddenly become overcast in the middle of June, rain had recommenced falling, and the downpour had been so heavy and continuous that all the ground was thoroughly sodden. To Mrs. Weldon personally, this incessant rainfall brought no other inconvenience beyond depriving her of her daily exercise, but to the natives in general, it was a very serious calamity. The ripening crops in the low-lying districts were completely flooded, and the inhabitants feared that they would be reduced to the greatest extremities. All agricultural pursuits had come to a standstill, and neither the Queen nor her ministers could devise any expedient to avert or mitigate the misfortune. They resolved at last to have recourse to the magicians, not those who are called in request to heal diseases or to procure good luck, but to the mganga, sorcerers of a superior order, who are credited with the faculty of invoking or dispelling rain. But it was all to no purpose. It was in vain that the mganga monotoned their incantations, flourished their rattles, jingled their bells, and exhibited their amulets. It was equally without avail that they rolled up their balls of dirt and spat in the faces of all the courtiers. The pitiless rain continued to descend, and the malign influences that were ruling the clouds refused to be propitiated. The prospect seemed to become more and more hopeless when the report was brought to Mona that there was a most wonderful mganga resident in the north of Angola. He had never been seen in this part of the country, but fame declared him to be a magician of the very highest order. Application, without delay, should be made to him. He surely would be able to stay the rain. Early in the morning of the 25th, a great tinkling of bells announced the magician's arrival at Kazund. The natives poured out to meet him on his way to the Chitoka, their minds being already predisposed in his favor by a moderation of the downpour, and by sundry indications of a coming change of wind. Ordinary practice of the professors of the magical art is to perambulate the villages in parties of 3 or 4, accompanied by a considerable number of acolytes and assistants. In this case the mganga came entirely alone. He was a pure Negro of most imposing stature, more than 6 feet high, and broad in proportion. All over his chest was a fantastic pattern traced in pipe clay, the lower portion of his body being covered with a flowing skirt of woven grass, so long that it made a trail. Round his neck hung a string of birds' skulls. Upon his head, he wore a leathern helmet ornamented with pearls and plumes, and about his waist was a copper girdle, to which was attached bells that tinkled like the harness of a Spanish mule. The only instrument indicating his art was a basket he carried made of a calabash containing shells, amulets, little wooden idols, and other fetishes, together with what was more important than all, a large number of those balls of dung, without which no African ceremony of divination could ever be complete. One peculiarity was soon discovered by the crowd. The mganga was dumb, and could utter only one low, guttural sound, which was quite unintelligible. This was a circumstance, however, that seemed only to augment their faith in his powers. With a stately strut that brought all his tinkling paraphernalia into full play, the magician proceeded to make the circuit of the marketplace. The natives followed in a troop behind, endeavoring, like monkeys, to imitate his every movement. He turned into the main thoroughfare and began to make his way direct to the royal residence, whence, as soon as the queen heard of his approach, she advanced to meet him. On seeing her, the mganga bowed to the very dust, then, rearing himself to his full height, he. Illustration: the entire crowd joined in. Page 441. Pointed aloft, and by the significance of his animated gestures indicated that, although the fleeting clouds were now going to the west, they would soon return eastwards with a rotatory motion irresistibly strong. All at once, to the surprise of the beholders, he stooped and took the hand of the mighty sovereign of Kazund. The courtiers hurried forward to check the unprecedented breach of etiquette, but the foremost was driven back with so staggering a blow that the others deemed it prudent to retire. The queen herself appeared not to take the least offense at the familiarity. She bestowed a hideous grimace, which was meant for a smile, upon her illustrious visitor, who, still keeping his hold upon her hand, started off walking at a rapid pace, the crowd following in the rear. He directed his steps towards the residence of Alves, and finding the door closed, applied his strong shoulder to it with such effect that it fell bodily to the ground, and the passive sovereign stood within the limits of the enclosure. The traitor was about to summon his slaves and soldiers to repel the unceremonious invasion of his premises, but on beholding the queen all stepped back with respectful reverence. Before Alves had time to ask the sovereign to what cause he was indebted for the honor of her visit, the magician had cleared a wide space around him, and had once again commenced his performances. Brandishing his arms wildly, he pointed to the clouds as though he were arresting them in their course. He inflated his huge cheeks and blew with all his strength, as if resolved to disperse the heavy masses, and then stretching himself to his full height, he appeared to clutch them in his giant grasp. Deeply impressed, the superstitious Mona was half beside herself with excitement. She uttered loud cries and involuntarily began herself to imitate every one of the mganga's gestures. The entire crowd joined in, and very soon the low guttural note of the sorcerer was lost, totally drowned in the turmoil of howls, shrieks, and discordant songs. To the chagrin, however, both of the queen and her subjects, there was not the slightest intimation that the clouds above were going to permit a rift by which the rays of the tropical sun could find a passage. On the contrary, the tokens of improvement in the weather, which had been observed in the early morning, had all disappeared. The atmosphere was darker than ever, and heavy storm drops began to patter down. A reaction was beginning to take place in the enthusiasm of the crowd. After all, then, it would seem that this famous mganga from whom so much had been expected had no power above the rest. Disappointment every moment grew more keen, and soon there was a positive display of irritation. The natives pressed around him with closed fists and threatening gestures. A frown gathered on Mona's face, and her lips opened with muttered words clear enough to make the magician understand that his ears were in jeopardy. His position was evidently becoming critical. An unexpected incident suddenly altered the aspect of affairs. The mganga was quite tall enough to see over the heads of the crowd, and all at once pausing in the midst of his incantations, he pointed to a distant corner of the enclosure. All eyes were instantly turned in that direction. Mrs. Weldon and Jack had just come out of their hut, and catching sight of them, the mganga stood with his left hand pointing towards them and his right upstretched towards the heavens. Intuitively, the multitude comprehended his meaning. Here was the explanation of the mystery. It was this white woman with her child that had been the cause of all their misery. It was owing to them that the clouds had poured down this desolating rain. With yells of execration, the whole mob made a dash towards the unfortunate lady who, pale with fright and rigid as a statue, stood clasping her boy to her side. The Mganga, however, anticipated them. Having pushed his way through the infuriated throng, he seized the child and held him high in the air, as though about to hurl him to the ground, a peace offering to the offended gods. Illustration: here they are, Captain, both of them. Mrs. Weldon gave a piercing shriek, and fell senseless to the earth. Lifting her up, and making a sign to the queen that all would now be right, the Mganga retreated, carrying both mother and child through the crowd, who retreated before him and made an open passage. Alves now felt that it was time to interfere. Already one of his prisoners had eluded his vigilance, and was he now to see two more carried off before his eyes? Was he to lose the whole of the expected ransom? No, rather would he see Kazan destroyed by a deluge, than resign his chance of securing so good a prize. Darting forwards, he attempted to obstruct the magician's progress, but public opinion was against him. At a sign from the queen, he was seized by the guards, and he was aware well enough of what would be the immediate consequence of resistance. He deemed it prudent to desist from his obstruction, but in his heart, he bitterly cursed the stupid credulity of the natives for supposing that the blood of the white woman or the child could avail to put an end to the disasters they were suffering. Making the natives understand that they were not to follow him, the magician carried off his burden as easily as a lion would carry a couple of kids. The lady was still unconscious, and Jack was all but paralyzed with fright. Once free of the enclosure, the Mganga crossed the town, entered the forest, and after a march of 3 miles, during which he did not slacken his pace for a moment, reached the bank of a river which was flowing towards the north. Here in the cavity of a rock, concealed by drooping foliage, a canoe was moored, covered with a kind of thatched roof. On this the magician deposited his burden, and sending the light craft into midstream with a vigorous kick, exclaimed in a cheery voice, "Here they are, Captain, both of them. Mrs. Weldon and Master Jack, both. We will be off now. I hope those idiots of Kazan will have plenty more rain yet. Off we go." Chapter 17. Drifting down the stream. Off we go. It was the voice of Hercules addressing Dick Sands, who, frightfully debilitated by recent sufferings, was leaning against Cousin Benedict for support. Dingo was lying at his feet. Mrs. Weldon gradually recovered her consciousness. Looking around her in amazement, she caught sight of Dick. "Dick, is it you?" she muttered feebly. The lad with some difficulty arose, and took her hand in his, while Jack overwhelmed him with kisses. "And who would have thought it was you, Hercules, that carried us away?" said the child. "I did not know you a bit, you were so dreadfully ugly." "I was a sort of a devil, you know, Master Jack," Hercules answered. "And the devil is not particularly handsome," and he began rubbing his chest vigorously to get rid of the white pattern with which he had adorned it. Mrs. Weldon held out her hand to him with a grateful smile. "Yes, Mrs. Weldon, he has saved you, and although he does not own it, he has saved me too," said Dick. "Saved," repeated Hercules. "You must not talk about safety, for you are not saved yet." And pointing to Benedict, he continued, "That's where your thanks are due. Unless he had come and informed me all about you and where you were, I should have known nothing, and should have been powerless to aid you." It was now 5 days since he had fallen in with the entomologist, as he was chasing the manticora, and unceremoniously had carried him off. As the canoe drifted rapidly along the stream, Hercules briefly related his adventures since his escape from the encampment on the Konza. He described how he had followed the Katanda which was conveying Mrs. Weldon, how in the course of his march he had found Dingo badly wounded, how he and the dog together had reached the neighborhood of Kazan, and how he had contrived to send a note to Dick, intending to inform him of Mrs. Weldon's destination. Then he went on to say that since his unexpected rencontre with Cousin Benedict, he had watched very closely for a chance to get into the garde depot, but until now had entirely failed. A celebrated Mganga had been passing on his way through the forest, and he had resolved upon impersonating him as a means of gaining the admittance he wanted. His strength made the undertaking sufficiently easy, and having stripped the magician of his paraphernalia and bound him securely to a tree, He painted his own body with a pattern like that which he observed on his victim's chest, and having attired himself with the magical garments, was quite equipped to impose upon the credulous natives. The result of his stratagem they had all that day witnessed. He had hardly finished his account of himself when Mrs. Weldon, smiling at his success, turned to Dick. "And how, all this time, my dear boy, has it fared with you?" she asked. Dick said, "I remember very little to tell you. I recollect being fastened to a stake in the riverbed, and the water rising and rising till it was above my head. My last thoughts were about yourself and Jack. Then everything became a blank, and I knew nothing more until I found myself amongst the papyrus on the riverbank, with Hercules tending me like a nurse." "You see I am the right sort of Mganga," interposed Hercules. "I am a doctor as well as a conjurer." "But tell me, Hercules, how did you save him?" "Oh, it was not a difficult matter by any means," answered Hercules modestly. "It was dark, you know, so that at the proper moment it was quite possible to wade in amongst the poor wretches at the bottom of the trench, and to wrench the stake from its socket. Anybody could have done it. Cousin Benedict could have done it. Dingo, too, might have done it. Perhaps, after all, it was Dingo that did it." "No, no, Hercules, that won't do," cried Jack. "Besides, look, Dingo is shaking his head. He is telling you he didn't do it." "Dingo must not tell tales, Master Jack," said Hercules, laughing. But nevertheless, although the brave fellow's modesty prompted him to conceal it, it was clear that he had accomplished a daring feat, of which few would have ventured to incur the risk. Inquiry was next made after Tom, Bat, Act-Aeon, and Austin. His countenance fell, and large tears gathered in his eyes as Hercules told how he had seen them pass through the forest in a slave caravan. They were gone, he feared they were gone forever. Mrs. Weldon tried to console him with the hope that they might still be spared to meet again some day, but he shook his head mournfully. She then communicated to Dick the terms of the compact that had been entered into for her own release, and observed that under the circumstances, it might really have been more prudent for her to remain in Kazand. "Then I have made a mistake. I have been an idiot in bringing you away," said Hercules, ever ready to depreciate his own actions. "No," said Dick, "you have made no mistake. You could not have done better. Those rascals, 10 chances to 1, will only get Mr. Weldon into some trap. We must get to Masames before Negoro arrives. Once there, we shall find that the Portuguese authorities will lend us their protection, and when old Alves arrives to claim his $100,000, he shall receive a good thrashing for his pains," said Hercules, finishing Dick's sentence and chuckling heartily at the prospect. It was agreed on all hands that it was most important that Negoro's arrival at Masames should be forestalled. The plan which Dick had so long contemplated of reaching the coast by descending some river seemed now in a fair way of being accomplished, and from the northerly direction in which they were proceeding it was quite probable that they would ultimately reach the Zaire, and in that case, not actually arrive at Espal de Londa. But that would be immaterial, as they would be sure of finding help anywhere in the colonies of Lower Guinea. On finding himself on the riverbank, Dick's first thought had been to embark upon one of the floating islands that are continually to be seen upon the surface of the African streams. But it happened that Hercules, during one of his rambles, found a native boat that had run adrift. It was just the discovery that suited their need. It was one of the long, narrow canoes, 30 feet in length by 3 or 4 in breadth, that with a large number of paddles can be driven with immense velocity, but by the aid of a single scull can be safely guided down the current of a stream. Dick was somewhat afraid that, to elude observation, it would be necessary to proceed only by night, but as the loss of 12 hours out of the 24 would double the length of the voyage, he devised the plan of covering the canoe with a roof of long grass, supported by a horizontal pole from stem to stern, and this not only afforded a shelter from the sun, but so effectually concealed the craft, rudder scull and all, that the very birds mistook it for one of the natural islets, and red-beaked gulls, black aringhas and gray and white kingfishers would frequently alight upon it in search of food. Though comparatively free from fatigue, the voyage must necessarily be long, and by no means free from danger, and the daily supply of provisions was not easy to procure. If fishing failed, Dick had the one gun which Hercules had carried away with him from the ant hill, and as he was by no means a bad shot, he hoped to find plenty of game, either along the banks or by firing through a loophole in the thatch. The rate of the current, as far as he could tell, was about 2 miles an hour, enough to carry them about 50 miles a day. It was a speed, however, that made it necessary for them to keep a sharp lookout for any rocks or submerged trunks of trees, as well as to be on their guard against rapids and cataracts. Dick's strength and spirits all revived at the delight of having Mrs. Weldon and Jack restored to him, and he assumed his post at the bow of the canoe, directing Hercules how to use the scull at the stern. A litter of soft grass was made for Mrs. Weldon, who spent most of her time lying thoughtfully in the shade. Cousin Benedict was very taciturn. He had not recovered the loss of the manticora, and frowned ever and again at Hercules, as if he had not yet forgiven him for stopping him in the chase. Jack, who had been told that he must not be noisy, amused himself by playing with Dingo. The first 2 days passed without any special incident. The stock of provisions was quite enough for that time, so that there was no need to disembark, and Dick merely lay to for a few hours in the night to take a little necessary repose. The stream nowhere exceeded feet in breadth. The floating islands moved at the same pace as the canoe, and except from some unforeseen circumstance, there could be no apprehension of a collision. The banks were destitute of human inhabitants, but were richly clothed with wild plants, of which the blossoms were of the most gorgeous colors. The asclepii, the gladiolus, the clematis, lilies, aloes, umbelliferae, arborescent ferns, and fragrant shrubs, combining on either hand to make a border of surpassing beauty. Here and there the forest extended to the very illustration. Hercules could leave the boat without much fear of detection. Shore and copal trees, acacias with their stiff foliage, bauhinias clothed with lichen, fig trees with their masses of pendant roots, and other trees of splendid growth rose to the height of 100 feet, forming a shade which the rays of the sun utterly failed to penetrate. Occasionally a wreath of creepers would form an arch from shore to shore, and on the 27th, to Jack's great delight, a group of monkeys was seen crossing one of these natural bridges, holding on most carefully by their tails, lest the aerial pathway should snap beneath their weight. These monkeys, belonging to a smaller kind of chimpanzee, which are known in Central Africa by the name of sokos, were hideous creatures with low foreheads, bright yellow faces, and long, upright ears. They herd in troops of about 10, bark like dogs, and are much dreaded by the natives on account of their alleged propensity to carry off young children. There is no telling what predatory designs they might have formed against Master Jack if they had spied him out, but Dick's artifice effectually screened him from their observation. 20 miles further on the canoe came to a sudden standstill. "What's the matter now, Captain?" cried Hercules from the stern. "We have drifted on to a grass barrier, and there is no hope for it. We shall have to cut our way through," answered Dick. "All right, I dare say we shall manage it," promptly replied Hercules, leaving his rudder to come in front. The obstruction was formed by the interlacing of masses of the tough, glossy grass known by the name of tikatika, which, when compressed, affords a surface so compact and resisting that travelers have been known by means of it to cross rivers dry-footed. Splendid specimens of lotus plants had taken root amongst the vegetation. As it was nearly dark, Hercules could leave the boat without much fear of detection, and so effectually did he wield his hatchet that, in 2 hours after the stoppage, the barrier was hewn asunder, and the light craft resumed the channel. It must be owned that it was with a sense of reluctance that Benedict felt the boat was again beginning to move forward. The whole voyage appeared to him to be perfectly uninteresting and unnecessary. Not a single insect had he observed since he left Kazand, and his most ardent wish was that he could return there and regain possession of his invaluable tin box. But an unlooked-for gratification was in store for him. Hercules, who had been his pupil long enough to have an eye for the kind of creature Benedict was ever trying to secure, on coming back from his exertions on the grass barrier, brought a horrible-looking animal and submitted it to the sullen entomologist. "Is this of any use to you?" The amateur lifted it up carefully, and having almost poked it into his nearsighted eyes, uttered a cry of delight. "Bravo, Hercules! You are making amends for your past mischief. It is splendid. It is unique." "Is it really very curious?" said Mrs. Weldon. Meanwhile the canoe was steadily threading its way over the dark waters, the silence of the night broken only by the rattle of the scales of some crocodiles, or by the snorting of hippopotamuses in the neighborhood. Once the travelers were startled by a loud noise, such as might. Illustration: it was caused by a troop of 100 or more elephants. Proceed from some ponderous machinery in motion. It was caused by a troop of 100 or more elephants that, after feasting through the day on the roots of the forest, had come to quench their thirst at the riverside. But no danger was to be apprehended. Lighted by the pale moon that rose over the tall trees, the canoe throughout the night pursued in safety its solitary voyage. Chapter 18. An anxious voyage. Thus the canoe drifted on for a week, the forests that for many miles had skirted the river ultimately giving place to extensive jungles that stretched far away to the horizon. Destitute, fortunately for the travelers, of human inhabitants, the district abounded in a large variety of animal life. Zebras, elands, camas sported on the bank, disappearing at nightfall before howling leopards and roaring lions. It was Dick's general custom, as he lay to for a while in the afternoon, to go ashore in search of food, and as the manioc, maize, and sorghum that were to be found were of a wild growth and consequently not fit for consumption, he was obliged to run the risk of using his gun. On the 4th of July he succeeded by a single shot in killing pacu, a kind of antelope about 5 feet long, with annulated horns, a tawny skin dappled with bright spots, and a white belly. The venison proved excellent, and was roasted over a fire procured by the primitive method practiced, it is said, even by guerrillas, of rubbing 2 sticks together. In spite of these halts, and the time taken for the night's rest, the distance accomplished by the 8th could not be estimated at less than 100 miles. The river, augmented by only a few insignificant tributaries, had not materially increased in volume. Its direction, however, had slightly changed more to the northwest. It afforded a very fair supply of fish, which were caught by lines made of the long stems of creepers furnished with thorns instead. Illustration: he stood face to face with his foe. Of fish hooks, a considerable proportion being the delicate sanjtkas, which when dried may be transported to any climate. Besides these there were the black uzakas, the wide-headed mons, and occasionally the little dagalas, resembling Thames whitebait. Next day, Dick met with an adventure that put all his courage and composure to the test. He had noticed the horns of a kama projecting above the brushwood, and went ashore alone with the intention of securing it. He succeeded in getting tolerably close to it and fired, but he was terribly startled when a formidable creature bounded along some 30 paces ahead and took possession of the prey he had just wounded. It was a majestic lion, at least 5 feet in height, of the kind called caramu, in distinction to the maneless species known as the Nyasi lion. Before Dick had time to reload, the huge brute had caught sight of him, and without relaxing its hold upon the writhing antelope beneath its claws, glared upon him fiercely. Dick's presence of mind did not forsake him. Flight, he knew, was not to be thought of. His only chance, he felt intuitively, would be by keeping perfectly still, and aware that the beast would be unlikely to give up a struggling prey for another that was motionless, he stood face to face with his foe, not venturing to move an eyelid. In a few minutes the lion's patience seemed to be exhausted. With a grand stateliness, it picked up the kama as easily as a dog would lift a hare, turned round, and lashing the bushes with its tail, disappeared in the jungle. It took Dick some little time to recover himself sufficiently to return to the canoe. On arriving, he said nothing of the peril to which he had been exposed, but heartily congratulated himself that they had means of transport without making their way through jungles and forests. As they advanced, they repeatedly came across evidences that the country had not been always, as now it was, utterly devoid of population. More than once, they observed traces which betokened the former existence of villages. Either some ruined palisades or the debris of some thatched huts, or some solitary sacred tree within an enclosure, would indicate that the death of a chief had, according to custom, made a native tribe migrate to new quarters.